Hello, and you're very welcome to ITF's Ask the Author session on how urban mobility or how urban delivery vehicles can boost electric mobility. This is a live webinar with our two lead report authors from the report. We'll have a 10-minute presentation followed by a Q&A session where we'll take your questions. So just a reminder again, please use the Q&A function to send us your questions, which we'll moderate live on the session. So I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Till Bunsen, who's a modular analyst at ITF, and Pier Paolo Casola, who's an advisor on energy, technology, and environmental sustainability at ITF. So this is a report that we launched last week at the ITF. We've already seen it being downloaded over 530 times by users. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Korean Automotive Technology Institute, KATTEC, the project funder in this instance. So as we said, my colleagues will take you through the main findings, what we did, what the issue was, what we found, and then we'll hopefully have a vibrant Q&A session following that. So I'll hand you over to Till Bunsen.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Roland, and thank you and welcome to all our listeners today. In this report, we evaluated the potential for electric light commercial vehicles, or LCVs, with a focus on last mile delivery fleets that operate in urban areas. So basically what we did here is a market study to see where we currently are in terms of market size, model availability, and viable use cases for electric LCVs, and also to see where the market is going to be in the near future. We really focus on vans used in cities, which at the moment appear to be the most viable use case. We had a close look at the challenges that are commonly named as holding back fleet electrification and outline solutions to them. Common ones here are the limited model availability for operators to choose from, small production scale at manufacturers that keeps prices relatively high, and also prices for vehicle batteries and availability of charging infrastructure. We also looked at the policy environment for those vehicles and came up with recommendations for governments that want to include electric light commercial vehicles in their mobility strategies for the coming years. And this work also extensively bases on an analysis of the cost performance and environmental performance of these vehicles using life cycle assessment and total cost of ownership analysis. So when we look at where the market currently is, we really see that there are more and more models available, and especially in the past 2 years. So many of the things that you can buy today, they haven't existed 3 years before. And currently we seem to be at an inflection point in the market. This is also mirrored by more and more fleet operators who announced to electrify their vehicles that came in recently. And among these operators that pledge to electrify fleets, those that operate on the last mile in urban areas seem to be the most common group. The two figures that you see here show on the top the vehicle stock and on the bottom the vehicle sales. The source of this is the IEA, and we see that in 2019 there were around 375 million electric LCVs operating in the world, most of them in China and in Europe. We expect this concentration to break up a little bit in the future, since more of the recent large announcements come from the United States. And despite these recent developments, we really see that LCVs really trail behind cars when it comes to electric mobility. In 2019, there were over 7 million electric cars sold worldwide, but only 70,000 electric LCVs, which is just about 1% of that. The model availability of electric LCVs reflects this gap between cars and LCVs. In 2019, there were around 300 electric car models available at the market. In our research, we only found about 30 models that are commonly available in terms of electric LCVs. Possible reasons for this gap between cars and LCVs is that many governments focus their electric mobility programs on the passenger segment first, and also most importantly, there's still a huge price gap in terms of upfront vehicle prices between conventional LCVs and electric ones, that we found to be almost 100% for some cases between the electric version and the conventional diesel version. One reason why this large price gap exists that we found is that for electric LCVs, the share of the electric powertrain and battery cost is much higher in final vehicle price than for passenger cars. And the figure here on the left axis, we see average total final vehicle prices for different car segments, divided by the categories or the components of powertrain costs in green and other vehicle components in blue. And on the right axis, you can see the percentage of powertrain cost in total vehicle price that is shown with the light blue marker here. Early electric car models were in the premium segments that are here in the figure, large cars or the SUV segments. And we see that the share of powertrain cost in final vehicle price for these is just over 10 or 15%. And for LCVs, on the other hand, it's much higher, it's over 20%. And an electric powertrain in an LCV has a much stronger impact on final price than in other vehicle segments. And this is part of the explanation why we think the price premium for electric versions remains much higher in the LCV market compared to cars. And it might also be a reason why vehicle manufacturers have focused their electrification strategies on the passenger segment first. This, in our opinion, overlooks significant potentials that arise from the user profile of LCVs. Electric LCVs are actually in a really good spot to maximize fuel cost savings through their very high mileage and to earn back those higher vehicle upfront costs. The figure here shows the average mileage of light commercial vehicles and two types of passenger cars, diesel and gasoline ones, at different stages of their lifetime. We see that especially in the first few years after vehicle registration, LCVs and diesel cars have almost double the mileage of gasoline passenger cars. The data that we see here is from Germany, where diesel cars are commonly used by companies, for instance, as company cars or as fleet cars, and gasoline cars are typically private owned. This is why diesel cars have a very high mileage that is comparable to LCVs, and the high mileage of LCVs just implies that the accumulated fuel cost savings from going electric can be much higher than for private passenger cars, and they should therefore be prioritized in electrification programs. Other studies that look specifically on the fleet composition or typical structure of LCV fleets find that vehicles that are operated in very large fleets on average drive much more than vehicles that are owned by smaller businesses. And those vehicles also typically are operated from depots where they can potentially charge overnight. And looking more specifically at the user profile of last mile delivery, a German study tells us that on average, they drive not really more than 70 kilometers a day and 6 days a week. And this user profile is very compatible with the electric LCV models that are currently on the market, and the range that these vehicles offer is generally compatible with what these users need. I'll now hand over to Pierre Paolo, who will go into more detail on the cost benefits and the environmental benefits that those vehicles can offer compared to alternatives.
Thank you, Till, and hi, everyone. I will speak briefly about our results on the total cost of ownership analysis and the life cycle emissions. So the key point that emerges from what you see on the screen, so incidentally on the left, you have a case with high fuel price and mileage of 25,000 kilometers a year, while on the right, the mileage is higher, 32,000. So here you see the total cost of ownership for different vehicle technologies, and this indicates essentially that if LCVs can be produced at a scale which is comparable to what is already happening for combustion vehicles, using existing, so current battery prices suggests that they can be cost competitive on a total cost of ownership basis against combustion alternatives. And of course, then if, I mean, there are differentiations that go further. This also depends on the size of the battery that is used to equip them and on the cost of the battery. Smaller battery sizes, which are still compatible for what Till just mentioned in terms of distances, would allow for greater cost competitiveness in the near term, and further reduction in battery costs would then enable even achieving cost competitiveness for larger packs. Of course, then higher mileage is also another element that helps achieving better cost competitiveness. Can you move to the next slide, please, Till? And while costs come down, even in areas of the world with low fuel prices, LCVs can achieve cost competitiveness. So essentially, this would start from high fuel price, high mileage, and then move progressively towards different parts of the world and different type of use case. Can you move to the next, please? Another interesting outcome. So here you see bars that show energy consumption per vehicle kilometer. So for different powertrains, again, looking at internal combustion, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and battery electric. So what is interesting here is that in terms of energy consumption, shifting towards greater fractions of driving on electricity ends up reducing the energy needs per kilometer, and this is taking into account energy that is needed across the supply chain. Can you move to the next? And similar results are also visible in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. One interesting thing is that part of the concerns that exist around BEVs on the incremental emissions of due to the need to manufacture batteries, well, in the case of LCVs, given their relatively high mileages, are such that even if there is an incremental amount of emissions imputable to the need to produce the battery, what you actually save from on the operational side is far larger. And so that means, and in addition, you also have opportunities to get further down by shifting towards renewable electricity. So that is, in a nutshell, there's a very significant potential for increased decarbonization if we switch to electric LCVs and then pair it with low greenhouse gas emissions in the power system. So I think I'll hand over again to Till for some more considerations on what is happening on key projects, and then I'll move on later for recommendations. So I'll pick up again. Till, all yours.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. So as I already mentioned, like more and more operators and OEMs seem to be picking up on those benefits that you just presented. And I already mentioned that the model availability has increased, especially in the past 2 years. This is currently particularly OEMs or original equipment manufacturers from Europe and from China, but also actors from the United States are becoming more and more active here. In terms of operators, we see that early adopters were national postal companies. Prominent examples are La Poste from France, Deutsche Post from Germany, or Korea Post in Korea. And recently, there's also a movement for larger global logistics companies to pledge to electrify their fleets. Examples here are the very prominent announcements from UPS that announced to purchase 10,000 electric vehicles, or the one from Amazon that pledges to take 100,000 electric vans into their fleet. And we can really see that currently the operator type of last mile urban delivery is the most prominent one. And that existing models are most suitable for this type of use. When we look at the motivations that companies commonly mention, at the moment, this is mostly environmental impacts and the desire of companies to reduce those. However, as the market increases, there is also a clear indication that the potential of electric vehicles to save costs also play a role. And some challenges remain. The relatively small model availability is really mentioned again and again when you ask operators what holds them back. And we see that the current model, they're really very suitable for last mile urban operators because they have small daily range requirements and not very high load requirements. However, for users that maybe have a higher daily range requirement or that have heavier loads, what is currently at the market is maybe not fully satisfying. And then also the production scale today is just really small and models are expensive. An example is that the common models of VW Crafter or Mercedes Sprinter, the electric versions of those are 80% more expensive than the diesel versions. And another thing that is commonly mentioned as a challenge is cost to install charging infrastructure. So the opportunity to operate these vehicles from depots generally makes it possible to use night charging with school chargers, which is very compatible to integrate them in the grid. At the same time, some operators face costs from needed grid enforcements, and there is sometimes uncertainty who's responsible for these. Back to you, Pierre.
Thanks, Till. So on the recommendations that we identified in the report, you'll find them spelled out in the executive summary and then explained across the report. So we think that there is a case for prioritizing the electrification of vehicles with high mileage and regular daily activity, and this is the case for LCVs used in urban deliveries. We also think that the urban mission profile, so the use of these vehicles in cities, is something that fits well with policies that can promote the use of electric light commercials in urban environment, and is consistent with the ambition of governments across the world to tighten the regulation of combustion engine vehicles, local governments or national governments. When it comes to national governments, the key instrument that can be used is the strengthening of fuel economy standards or zero emission mandates, and which can be combined, especially in the initial phase, with economic incentives for the purchase of light commercial vehicles. Initial phase only because this makes more sense in order to achieve the scale that is required to bring down unit costs, and it would not be viable to be sustained over time. Next, please. We also have additional recommendation regarding some more detail, some greater detail. In particular, the first one is about the need to clarify who pays for cost upgrades related with the upgrade of the electricity grid in order to ensure that vehicles can be charged, for example, in large depots. At the moment, it's not clear if these kind of costs need to be borne by the depot owner and whoever asks for that connection, or by the network operator. So it's important to clearly define who will carry those costs. If this falls on the depot owner, this may actually pose significant problems in terms of TCO, total cost of ownership. And then there is scope for cutting costs from sharing components. This is already happening for internal combustion engine vehicles with passenger cars and across different segments. So the same should be also applied to electric versions. And also the idea of sharing platforms across ICEs and electric may actually be a good solution to cut unit costs. So ensure that the ICE platforms are EV ready. And finally, picking up on what Till mentioned, there's a need to strengthen cooperation between stakeholders, in particular purchasers of vehicles and equipment manufacturers, in order to reduce the risk profile of manufacturers that want to actually scale up significantly the production of electric commercial vehicles. I'll stop it here. Thanks again for listening to this, and we're happy to take questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Pier Paolo. Thank you very much, Till. very clear and concise presentation of the report. The next part of this presentation is the Q&A section. As Pier Paolo mentioned, we're trying to keep this as a short format that follows all of our ITF reports that we release. So we have a few questions coming in already. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you want to address any questions to our lead authors. We'll also be running a short poll to check with you how useful you think this format is. I'll give you a little warning before that pops up on your screen, but we'd appreciate your participation in that. So a first question in from One Jelan, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. One says that you say that the early adopters have been public postal systems. Where do you see the role of the private sector investment to mainstream electric LCVs? And what are the main barriers hindering private sector investment in this area? Who would like to take that question?
I can start, and then maybe Pier Paolo will add. So it's right that the early examples are really postal companies, and interestingly, this was often enabled by green procurement programs. One example being French Post, where the government really said we want 10,000 electric commercial cars for our fleet. And the private actors, it's really a development of the past years that they enter the market. And the number one limit or challenge that they mentioned was really model availability all along. And I think their role in the future will be that at the moment, it really seems that it's often the environmental awareness that moves them to adopt electric vehicles. However, now we see those very large announcements of 10,000 vehicles for UPS or 100,000 for Amazon. That really shows that they see value in lower operation costs. And I think in the midterm, this will simply be a business case for them to adopt.
So to add to that, what I would like to say is that I think what really can make a difference is the reduction of risks for manufacturers, which requires striking deals about large orders, as Till just mentioned, but also can be supported by a clear signals on the policy side, whether this comes from national governments, for example, through the standards or the economic incentives, or whether this comes from local governments on the access to low emission vehicles, restricted to low emission vehicles to portions of the city. In any case, those are solutions that would increase the level of confidence of whoever needs to to mobilize significant investment to be able to produce vehicles at scale. Without scale, it's going to be difficult to ensure that there is a compelling case for lower total cost of ownership. And so what really needs to be addressed now is this scale up, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you both very much. Interesting questions are coming in. An obvious one comes in from an anonymous attendee on the cost of grid infrastructure, and how do we think that should be tackled?
I can take this. I think grid infrastructure is something that should probably be tackled as part of a broader strategy. I understand that lots of governments at the moment have an interest in supporting network developments, given the importance of that electrification has for a transition towards a low carbon future. I think even the IEA is underlining the importance of making investment to ensure that the network will be ready for a transition to a more environmentally friendly world. So whether I personally think that placing the burden of this network investment only on the last user, adding to the existing consumption, is something that is suboptimal. I think that ensuring that there is a coordinated strategy about this type of things, this type of developments, is probably a better solution. I also think this really depends on local circumstances. It's not just a one size fits all. So, but broadly speaking, I don't think the network question should be seen as something that only links to the electrification of LCVs. It's a broader type of question that needs a broader type of answer.
Okay, thanks very much, Pier Paolo. Just before we take the next question, we're going to run the poll now. Onda, if you'd like to get that going. This is a little poll to help us to tailor these events to your needs and to gauge the satisfaction in these events. So if you don't mind answering that for us, 2 very quick questions, we'd be very grateful. The next question comes from Christopher Hodder, who's from the Fédération Internationale de Motocyclisme, who mentions that although the report concentrates on LCVs, what role do you think lightweight vehicles may have in the future, and particularly electric motorcycles, lightweight 2- and 3-wheelers? Who'd like to take that question?
I can give it a go. So yeah, that's a really good question, I think. So the report really focuses on LCV, which is why we mostly speak about this vehicle type. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that there's also a lot happening in the space of electric 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers. For instance, much of electrified delivery operations that exist in China are electric 2-wheelers. There are also examples from Switzerland where the Post operates, I think, 7,000 electric 2-wheelers. And also forward-looking, there are actually some projects announced. For instance, Amazon has a big program for electric 3-wheelers in India. I think ultimately it always depends a bit on the context. So we see smaller vehicles especially suitable in relatively small delivery zones. And it also depends on the type of delivery. So for instance, if you have a zone with many commercial clients that receive large deliveries, then 2 or 3-wheelers are less suitable. The big advantage is that they contribute less to congestion. And also in Europe, there are some projects, particularly with cargo bikes, that see if smaller vehicles can be used for last mile delivery. And in my opinion, it's something that can ease problems of congestion, but if they are viable in a specific case or not is always a bit depending on the context.
Okay, very good. Next question we have is from Salvador Saavedra. Salvador Saavedra from Entorno Industrial, who asks, what are the most common incentives for the use or purchase of electric delivery vehicles from federal and city governments?
I can go for this. So, like for other electric vehicles, incentives come from either the regulatory framework requires the deployment of the vehicles, for example, with zero emission mandates, and then there is a response that comes from the vehicle producers themselves in terms of the way they offer the vehicles. There are incentives that take the form of differentiated taxation for vehicle purchase that reduce the upfront costs of purchasing electric solutions. There are also incentives that increase the value proposition of electric vehicles. For example, travel restriction for vehicles that have a higher emission profile for local pollutants, and then waivers for vehicles that have a lower emission profile. These combined with clear signals on the intention to actually strictly enforce this type of regulations in the forthcoming years is something that can have direct impacts in the cost of ownership. For example, by altering the pace of depreciation of combustion engine vehicles versus low or zero emission vehicles, and slowing down depreciation for the low and zero emission vehicles in comparison to what you see for the combustion vehicles. And that is quite interesting because it does provide a very concrete monetary incentive, even if at the origin this is not intended to be something that has a policy that has a direct economic impact.
Okay, very good. We'll wrap the session up soon enough. We tried to keep it to a short 30-minute format. There's time for a few more questions still. A new question in from Vladas Lasas. Can we give examples of countries with best practice or regulation in this area? Gentlemen, do you have ideas of good best practice examples globally?
I mean, it depends a bit where you look at. So currently it's really China is the leader, then Europe, United States will follow next, I believe. When we look at urban regulations, like one really important driver seem to be zero emission zones that really give a strong push to operators to electrify their fleets. There are very prominent examples for China where they already exist and where they have enabled reaching very high or full shares of electric vehicles in delivery fleets. But this is something that is coming more and more. An example from Europe is the Netherlands that pledged to make 35 or 40 cities zero emissions in the center. So I think each region has their good examples, and right now I think it's the three: China, Europe, and United States that's leading.
Okay, very good. To finish up, a lot of the presentation talks about the very large operators, the Amazon type companies, whereas many of or the majority of these vehicles are owned by smaller operation, mom and pop type operations who can't necessarily afford EVs at the moment. How can we help enterprises like this to choose cleaner technology?
So some of the policies that, for example, focus on differentiated taxation on the vehicle purchase can be tailored based on different vehicle types and at different scales. So that could help ensuring that more of these hits smaller vehicle companies rather than larger ones. But also there is a natural development in a way that typically characterizes the usage profile of these vehicles. Often new vehicles are purchased in bulk, in big orders, and then they trickle down to the rest of the market once they are sold secondhand, and they begin to travel less. So there is an effect that can take place in basically thanks to the very nature of the way new vehicles, new light commercial vehicles enter into the fleet. So although these the differentiated measures for different players are not easy to implement, they can be an instrument. Additionally, there could be other instruments, for example, fiscal instruments that provide greater capacity to increase the availability of funding for smaller players compared to the large players, if there is a need for a blanket measure that addresses any kind of vehicle entering the city, for example.
Okay, interesting. Okay. We'll need to wrap it up now. We'll take one last question. Interestingly, in the absence of a secondary market for electric vehicles, is that an impediment for getting finance? I presume by secondary market, we mean the market for second-hand EVs?
I suppose.
Yeah.
So what I can say on this, maybe Till, I don't know if you want to add, if there is a capacity, thanks to policy developments, to ensure that scale can grow and costs can become competitive on a TCO basis for a broader range of uses, there is going to be a case feasible for finance, basically because there's a possibility to demonstrate that by choosing this solution, one ends up spending less for delivering the service that would be otherwise delivered within the internal combustion engine vehicles. So that is essentially something that can help making a case to raise, to have access to loans that then are sustained by a good economic case by whichever user wants to adopt it. So the challenge, in my opinion, is to ensure that the transitional phase is such that we can increase the scale of production, and that is probably something that needs to happen by bringing in major players and mobilization and clear signals on the fact that policy will go in that direction, to ensure that there is a greater level of confidence in investing and making the changes required on the supply side to enable that. I think what is interesting is that now there's a quite high level of confidence that electrification, direct electrification, will be an important technology, an important technological solution for let's say the lighter vehicles. I think it's beyond doubt that this is something that will come in. There are also flexibilities possible in different ways to bring electrification in. We didn't talk very much about it, but PHEVs are also an option that if can actually effectively be driven electric most of the time, can also deliver both in terms of TCO and life cycle emission reduction.
Okay, great. Thank you both very much. We'll wrap up the session there. We went a little bit over time. Just a reminder that this report is part of the overall ITF Decarbonising Transport initiative. And as you can see, it's a very dynamic area of our work. We've included a link in the chat if you'd like to know a little bit more. Sign up for our alerts, of course. My thanks to Pier Paolo Casola, Till Bunsen, Onda Monnier, who's done the technical side. The recording of this session will be available later on today, and you can subscribe to ITF alerts to stay in touch. Thank you all very much indeed, and wishing you a good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.